Hello, my name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program today on sacrifice and ritual in Iron Age Britain. Our presenter is Ellen Green, who joins us from London. Quick bit of business. You're invited to put your questions into the chat, and I'll ask them on your behalf when Ellen concludes her presentation. Today's program will be recorded, which means we will be placing it on the library's YouTube channel forever after. And I will send the link to the video to everyone who registered for today's program. So if you'll be able to share it or rewatch it if you like. Before we get started, I'm going to put up a 2-question poll. Interesting. We have 30%, 31% from the UK, 2% from the EU, and 5% from other, which I guess means Antarctica. Thanks very much, everyone. And now let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Ellen Green got her start in Glencoe, where she was surely the most interesting student ever to emerge from New Trier High School. She also worked at the Glencoe Public Library. She worked as a field archaeologist in London for 5 years before returning to academia to work on a PhD at the University of Reading, which is where she is now. She specializes in bioarchaeology with the research focusing on human and animal remains found in odd places during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods in England. This is her, sorry about my phone. This is her 5th presentation for the Glencoe Library, and we've enjoyed over the years hearing Ellen speak about Bronze Age horse remains that she found in Transylvania, bone-strewn plague pits, and 17th century watermills. Can't wait to see what she'll talk about today. So Ellen, so glad to have you back with us, and you may go ahead.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Grace. And without further ado, sacrifice and ritual in Iron Age Britain. So the first thing I'm going to say is to let you in on a little archaeological secret, and that is that when archaeologists say the word ritual, it's usually code for we don't know what something is. Things are often designated ritual if there's no immediately obvious functional use for them, which I think is a bit of an oversimplification of something that's quite complex. Obviously, people's beliefs can be quite difficult to trace when you just have material remains. So there is this idea that if it doesn't have an immediately obvious use, it must be for ritual or religious purposes. But people in the past wouldn't have necessarily separated out what to them was religious and what was mundane and everyday. It all would have been bundled up together. So while this is a talk on ritual and sacrifice, do keep in mind that to some extent, a lot of these things have been designated ritual just because to us, they are weird. And the British Iron Age is very weird. In particular, which is why I love it as a subject. So when I talk about the Iron Age in Britain, I am talking about the period between 800 BCE and 43 CE, which is when the Romans invade Britain. Actually, some of the examples I'm going to talk about today are post-conquest, because I think it's quite illuminating often to look at post-conquest things, just to look at continuity. It's important to remember really with the Iron Age, especially the late Iron Age, there is contact between Britain and the Roman world, particularly Gaul, which is modern day France. This society isn't existing in a vacuum. There are trade links going on. So you might have heard the Iron Age referred to as the Celtic period, or heard people talking about Celtic Britain or Celtic Europe. I really don't like the term Celtic. It's a term that the Romans used to describe pretty much everyone in Western Europe. And it gets used to talk about material from Spain, material from France, material from Britain, material from Switzerland, and all of these places are very different. So I don't like that, but that is the period we're talking about. This is a picture a 16th century picture, actually, drawn after Caesar's description of what Iron Age people looked like. He said they used to go into battle naked, except for occasionally torques, and painted with blue paint called woad. So I quite like this rather fanciful picture. So who were the people of Iron Age Britain? Well, it's really hard to come up with any generalizations about Iron Age Britain because the material is really variable. And the only sort of blanket statement I can make is that I can't make blanket statements. What's going on in the southeast of England is very different to what's going on in the west of England, which is different from what's going on in Wales, which is different from the north of England, which is different from Scotland. My PhD research is very focused on southern England. So a lot of my examples are going to be from the south. This is just because it's what I know best. But keep in mind that everything I'm talking about, loads of exceptions, none of this can be blanket applied. So, sorry. This photo on the left is Maiden Castle Hill Fort in Dorset, which is in southern England. As you can see from the scale, it's absolutely huge. It's the biggest hill fort in England, but even the small ones are pretty enormous. I was going to use some photos I took from a trip I took to a hill fort over Christmas, and I wanted to use my own photos, but it is impossible to get photos of a hill fort that really, where you can see it from the ground. They're too big. Now, the Romans liked to say that people in the Iron Age were these sort of primitive savages. I think hill forts kind of give the lie to that, personally. Yes, the political situation was probably quite fluid. We know there was a lot of violence. But something like this, which was built by hand, takes an awful lot of labor. Just the scale of it, these walls would have been built, their earthwork, ramparts. Even with modern machinery, building something like this would take forever. So the idea that people were able to organize and do it when they were working with, at best, iron tools is pretty astounding. So hill forts have lots of different uses. Maiden Castle and the ones in central South Britain usually have signs of occupation, so people would have lived sort of in the middle here. This little figurine is part of a cooking implement. It was found by metal detectors in 2018. So depictions of humanoid figures are not common in the Iron Age. Most Iron Age art is this beautiful, very abstract, looping patterns, which you'll see a lot of in the talk, and I'll show you. So it's quite nice that we have this figurine, but it's not the norm to get representative figures. We know this guy is probably someone important. We don't know if he's a god or a hero or a mythological figure or just a particularly important local person, but we do know he's important because he is holding a torque. Now, torques are sort of necklaces, and we know that they're associated with power and with status and hierarchy in the Iron Age. Also, much like those pictures from Caesar's descriptions, you can just see, it's a bit hard to see on this photo, actually, I apologize for that. He's got a mustache. He's got this excellent little mullet, which is quite fun, I think. So when you hear modern perceptions about the Celtic period, first of all, people are almost always talking about the Druids. These two pictures are pictures I found actually by just Googling Druid. This is the Druid Getafix from the Asterix and Obelix comics, which are French. You can see he's very much the standard popular idea of what a Druid is. He's got this long white beard, he's wearing a white robe, he's always making things in his cauldron and giving potions to the heroes of the comic. And these are some modern Druids at Stonehenge. I'm assuming summer solstice from the weather. I hate to break it to you, but the sort of Druidism that is practiced by these people have nothing to do with Druidism in the Iron Age. Stonehenge is quite a bit older. than the period we're talking about, and there's no real evidence that it was significant to Iron Age people. In fact, when we look at religion in the Iron Age, we don't really have any monumental architecture. It's one of the things that makes it quite difficult to study and learn about. We don't really have necessary temples. You get some Romano-Celtic temples, sort of in the later periods, but you don't have things like megaliths. And most of what we sort of think of as shrines or sanctuaries from the Iron Age, they tend to be areas that are enclosed by ditches and that we've identified as being sort of religious or ritually significant by the sorts of finds we find in them, rather than any sort of architecture. This sort of winds up. The Romans tell us that people in the Iron Age very much worshipped in sort of open groves. There's a lot of descriptions. In fact, there's a very violent description that Tacitus gives, which this is actually part of this quote here, of the Romans burning down one such grove in Anglesey, which is in Wales. Now, people in the Iron Age didn't have any writing themselves. So we are purely reconstructing what we know of them from material artifacts. Think of it almost as going through your neighbor's trash to try and work out what their beliefs are, which is difficult. And particularly early studies of the Iron Age leaned very heavily on what the Romans had to say. Now, the Romans were a conquering people. They had a bit of an agenda, to say the least. And with the exception of Caesar, most of the Roman authors who write about Britain have never been to Britain and are a couple hundred years out from what they're talking about. So they're not exactly first-hand accounts. Caesar is a first-hand account. Caesar had a political agenda, to put it mildly. And even if we aren't considering the political agenda, the Romans are looking at a culture in crisis that is dealing with a hostile invading force. And also, the Romans put things very much in sort of the Roman worldview, into terms and ways that they could understand that aren't necessarily accurate to what people in the Iron Age might have said about their beliefs themselves. Now, the Roman accounts are great fun. They are very gory, as you can see. You know, they talk about people who drench their altars in the blood of prisoners. And Caesar writes about Wicker Men. So if you've ever seen the wonderful British horror film Wicker Man, it's actually based on what Caesar said people in France were doing. Now, the reason I've included this, despite it being specifically about France, not Britain, is because Caesar also said that the Druids, who were sort of in charge of all the religious activities and who officiated these sacrifices, were actually all trained in Britain. They used to train in Britain and then come back to France. And it was meant to be this big cabal. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later, but I think it is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration. I think it's very unlikely that there was one very centralized school of people controlling religion in all of these areas, because quite frankly, again, we don't find the same sorts of things archaeologically. There is no archaeological proof for Wicker Men. I don't know necessarily what you would expect to find. Pyre sites, if they are not in some way protected or covered over, wouldn't necessarily survive archaeologically. Having said that, I think it's a tradition we might have heard more about than one account from Caesar if it were true. Religion in Iron Age Britain is very hard to pin down. Anyone who tells you that they know exactly what's going on with religion in Iron Age Britain is deeply mistaken. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that people in the Iron Age didn't write things down, and they weren't really into representations. We don't have artwork that we can say this is of a god or this is of a mythological figure, really. So those of you who are familiar with British archaeology will have noticed by now that these pictures that I've put up, they're very Roman looking. And that's because they are Roman. these are both from after the conquest, and even though they theoretically depict pre-conquest gods, they have been through this lens of Romanization. So this woman right here, this bust, this is Sulius Minerva, who was worshipped at Bath. If you ever get the chance to go check out the Roman baths and her shrine at Bath in England, you absolutely should, because it is absolutely astounding. She is a mixture of the Roman god Minerva and the local god Sulius. Sulius appears to be a local goddess of the springs at Bath. For those who don't know, Bath has these hot springs that are considered to be incredibly medicinal. They have a very high sulfur content. And she was meant to be a goddess of healing and of these springs. And the Romans came in, they saw this goddess, and they went, ah, that's like our goddess Minerva. And so you get this sort of combined expression. And that's quite common in the Roman Empire generally. But even in cases where we have gods that don't seem to have been combined, such as Coventina, who is, we've got a couple of inscriptions to her in northern England. And again, she's a goddess of springs and streams. There's very much a trend with Iron Age material, particularly religious and ritual material, to be associated with watery places, with streams, rivers, bogs. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later, but it is very much, we think that watery places was very important to people. Now, Coventina may not be a combination of a Roman and local god. She may just be a local god, but it doesn't change the fact that the expressions of her, these inscriptions and these carvings, are all post-conquest and all are being conceptualized in a very Roman way. There's definitely been a shift in how people are worshipping her after the conquest. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to take this and reflect it back to the pre-conquest periods. What's going on in 800 BCE is probably quite different to what's going on after the conquest. So when we have names of Iron Age gods, like Epona or Cyrannus or Coventina, it's great that we have these names, but you do have to remember that they're all coming from post-conquest sources. So they have been through an interpretive lens. So the most talked about thing really with religion in the Iron Age, and again, we have Caesar to thank for this, as well as the Victorians who were very obsessed with it, is Druids. Caesar tells us that, sorry, Caesar tells us that Druids formed this large group of people, select people who were trained in Britain. They were very important. They officiated all the sacrifices, which Caesar tells us the worst punishment that could be meted out on people in the Iron Age was for them to be disallowed from the sacrifices. That was way worse than death. So we get the idea that this is very important. But Druids were also meant to act as judges and arbiters of the law and as healers. So they, at least according to Caesar, they have this very defined and very important role in society. Question is, how do we recognize that archaeologically? The Iron Age is interesting because actually only 5% of people that we think were alive then are represented archaeologically. We don't have lots of graves. I'll talk about it more in a bit, but what people are doing with the dead in the Iron Age is a bit of an archaeological mystery. And where we do have graves, people aren't being buried with nice little tags saying, I'm Bob the Druid. It's very much trying to put together lots of disparate contextual clues. So there is a lot of argument amongst archaeologists about Druids. I think a lot of archaeologists like to sidestep the issue to some extent because it's very hard to prove one way or the other. But some archaeologists have waded into this fight, and this is the sort of thing that they tend to argue. So these spoons are a artifact that has been associated with druids and with divination and priests in the Iron Age. The spoons always tend to be found in pairs. They've been found in England. This particular pair is from Wales. There are a couple examples also from France. You always get one with a hole in and one with the sort of cross incised. Now, these are the wrong curvature to be any good for eating. They don't really look like cooking utensils. Also, it's a bit weird that they always come in pairs. And they've done chemical analysis on this particular pair, and they found that each one of these quadrants would have been a different color. So the idea is that a liquid or a powder would have been poured through the first spoon, gone through the hole, and landed on the second spoon, and then that might have been interpreted as a form of divination or fortune telling. Hard to prove for sure, but it is a theory that makes some amount of sense given what we're looking at. And you can see I was telling you about the very abstract circular patterns that are characteristic of Iron Age art. You've got them here, and you've got them again here. Now, this is the skull of a man that was found in Kent, late Iron Age, at a place called Mill Hill. This is a warrior burial. He was found with a sword and a shield, and it was a very wealthy grave with lots of spectacular artifacts. Warrior burials are really quite rare in Iron Age England. It's much more of a continental tradition. And this guy was wearing this rather fabulous headpiece. So again, you've got this beautiful artwork present there. Now, what exactly this headpiece is has been the subject of quite a bit of debate. Generally, in most things you read about these burials, it's referred to as a crown. And it's of a design that is typologically very British. Despite the fact that warrior burials are rare in Britain, he does seem to have been buried with very British grave goods. But the interesting thing about this crown is that later Romano-British priests, in a lot of inscriptions and pictures, seem to be wearing very similar headgear. And this has led some people to theorize that it might be a form of Iron Age religious headgear. That is by no means a thing that everyone agrees on, but it is an interesting theory. And to sort of give you an idea of how difficult it really can be, this is a case from Stanway in southern England, near Colchester. Depending on which press release you read and which archaeological source you read, there are some very different interpretations of this grave. It's an absolutely fabulous grave, though. I have my own opinions about this grave, but I will let you make up your own mind. So this is from the late Iron Age. It's a cremation, so there's the cremated remains there. The grave contained lots of grave goods. You have an amphora, so that's a traded good from the Roman Empire, probably had wine in it. You've got a board game. So these bits of copper alloy would have been the corners of the board, and you've got the gaming tokens here all laid out. You've got a series of pots and pans, including a strainer bowl, which they did chemical analysis to and found it contained traces of the herb artesma, which is a medicinal herb. And it's got, finally, these surgical tools. Now, these medical tools are very Roman. Again, they would have been a foreign object that was traded or brought in from elsewhere. They're not something that's sort of typical of Iron Age Britain. So Caesar said that druids were healers. So some people found this grave, saw the doctor's tools and the medical herbs that were found in the strainer bowl, and they have said that this must represent a druid because healer was the sort of role that Caesar assigns. Other people have seen this grave and said it must represent a doctor. Why would you jump immediately to druid when really all we have is evidence that this person was probably doing something medical? And that sort of shows you how hard it can be. Interpretation is not a straightforward thing, and archaeologists do have to weigh where they want to use textual sources and how biased or accurate they think those textual sources are. How much should we believe Caesar when he talks about druids, particularly given that we have no way of actually recognizing them archaeologically? Now, I said before, only 5% of the population of the Iron Age is recognizable in the archaeological record. The reasons why that might be is an interesting mystery, and actually one of the things my PhD is looking at. But it's important to understand that where we do have burials, they tend to be in a couple of very localized traditions. There are a couple areas of the country where you still get bodies. And one of those places is Yorkshire in the north of England, where you get what are called Eris culture graves. And the best part about Eris culture graves is you get these fabulous chariot burials. Now, chariot burials are, again, way more common in continental Europe. For a long time, it was sort of thought that these chariot burials in Yorkshire represented a migrating people or an invasion of some sort. But they've done isotope studies of some of these chariot burials, and they have found that the people in these graves are people who grew up in Yorkshire, who grew up locally. So it could just be a case of two different places having similar traditions. Chariot burials would have been for very elite people. It's a high status thing. They would have been very expensive. And you can see here, you've got the chariot, and you've got the two wheels, and you've actually got the horses that would have gone with the chariot as well. And then you've got the woman whose burial this is, sort of tucked up in the middle there. These burials tend to be very wealthy. This is a shield boss, again, found from this particular example, and it's got absolutely gorgeous artistry. It's copper alloy. It would have been quite a beautiful artifact. I mean, it still is. But if you think about that, copper alloy would have been a very bright, shiny metal before it sort of corroded and turned green. It would have been very striking. And chariot burials tend to be under barrows, which again would have made a mark in the landscape, and again tend to be something that's very unique to this area of Britain. While you do get barrows all over Britain, they tend to be from different time periods and not from the Iron Age. So on the sort of opposite end of the spectrum from very, very nice inhumations, you also get cremations. Now, these are very common in Kent, in southeastern England. You do still get some inhumations in Kent, but primarily they're cremations. Just because they're cremations doesn't mean that they aren't really fancy. So this is a recreation of an Aylesford swaddling cremation in the British Museum, and you can see it's got 5 amphorae. Again, these would have represented trade with the Roman Empire. They would have been filled with wine. You've got a couple of different Roman sort of pottery types in here. You've got quite a lot of pottery. You've got some nice metalwork. You've got some gaming counters, and you've got the actual cremation. Now, the cremations sort of run the gambit of being put in the ground without anything, to those with really, really nice grave goods. And you get them in a variety of containers. So it looks like this example, judging from this bit of copper alloy here, probably would have been wrapped in something organic that's rotted away. But you also get cremations in really beautiful artifacts like this. This is a bucket. I know that buckets are not normally what you think of when you think of something really fancy, but if you look at the workmanship on this, it is astounding. You've got this beautiful sort of looping pattern. It looks like you've got some sort of animal represented, and you've got this fabulous little head mounts that show either a very elaborate headdress or some really cool hair. Again, we're not quite sure which. And this bucket would have been quite a prestige item. It's very well crafted. So you've got some sort of localized burial traditions, but most of the bodies you find from the Iron Age are what we in modern days think of as weird. You get lots of disarticulated, so like this, where all the bones are jumble, deposits in places that don't seem appropriate to us in modern day. Grain storage pits are very common, ditches, quarry pits, wells, lots of places that seem almost disrespectful. In fact, when a lot of these assemblages were first found, they were used as evidence that people didn't care about the dead. So again, good old Caesar, he tells us that the Druids taught that when you die, your body's not important, that you reincarnate. And so there's this sort of belief amongst early archaeologists that people in the Iron Age just didn't care what happened to bodies. Now, there have been quite a lot of studies since then. It's shown this sort of placement. Statistically, it doesn't look like it's just casual or random. It actually appears to be very deliberate. So then there's this question of why you have all these dismembered bodies. And there are a couple of theories about that. But one of the theories is that it's due to this process called excarnation. Excarnation is where you let a body decay, usually just outside. You wait till all the flesh is off and then you bury the bones, which would explain why the bones aren't sort of in anatomical position. They've been moved. Also explain why sometimes we find deposits that only have certain bones, that there's a degree of curation, that people are choosing certain bits of the body to bury and in certain places. If bones are left out to excarnate for long enough and not collected or deposited, it is perfectly feasible that they wouldn't make it into the archaeological record. They wouldn't survive. And my PhD is specifically looking at some of the bones from these odder deposits to see if they've been excarnated or not. Another theory as to why we don't have any, or we don't have many human remains really from the Iron Age, is that they're intentionally being deposited in fast-flowing water. These three skulls were found in the Walbrook in London. The Walbrook skulls were originally thought to be evidence of Roman reprisals against the Boudiccan Rebellion. That's been disproven now. And it looks like actually they're from bodies that were buried very close to the edge of the River Walbrook, and the graves have been eroded away. And there are some scholars that think this is very intentional, that depositing bodies in water might be a funerary rite, and that if you're depositing them in fast flowing water close enough to the ocean, you wouldn't necessarily have any traces. It's interesting to note at this point that people in the Iron Age generally don't eat much fish, if any fish, even in coastal regions. So that's also been used to maybe argue that they might be getting rid of bodies in water, and you don't necessarily want to eat fish that have eaten dead bodies. It's tenuous. But it is an interesting theory, and there is definitely something going on again with water sources and religion in the Iron Age. Other theories include the idea that they might be cremating people but not necessarily burying the remains. I think it's unlikely that one answer fits all of the cases in Britain. I think it's much likely to be a combination of lots of different factors. Now, water. You get so many deposits of amazing artifacts and of skeletons in water from the Iron Age. So this is the Battersea Shield. It was found in London. It was fished out of the Thames. The Museum of London actually a couple of years ago had an exhibit that had a series of things that they'd fished out of the Thames, and it is astounding. There are swords, helmets, shields, jewelry, beautiful metalwork, coins, and it's quite common in really throughout Britain in watery places to find these deposits of very nice artifacts. And while it's true that some of them might be accidental losses, it does look like some of them are deliberately deposited, particularly where they have been deposited in large groups. Now, it's not just watery places, although watery places do have more than their fair share, really, of these deposits. But you also get things in any sort of space that seems to be a boundary. So boundary ditches in particular often have hoards and often have animal skeletons that appear to have been buried as whole animals, and these have often been interpreted as sacrifice, evidence of animal sacrifice. Hoards, which is when you get large amounts of very nice artifacts, usually metalwork, often coins, or in the case of the Snettisham hoard, these are all torques that have been deliberately deposited. There is a lot of argument about whether or not hoards represent religious deposition and votive deposition, where people are burying things as a sacrifice to the gods, or whether people are burying things because the Iron Age was a very tumultuous time politically, and if the army, an army is coming up to kill you and you want to run away, maybe you hide your valuables first. I think that, again, it's not one answer fits all. There's a variety of reasons, but I think in a lot of cases there is a lot of evidence that these things are being almost removed from the world of the living, are being buried with some sort of intent to sacrifice them, mainly because of where they're buried. So some of them are buried in really inaccessible places. It's also very common to find deposits in doorways and under doorways. These, again, sort of run the complete spectrum of maybe finding animals. Dogs are quite common in particular, or pottery or nice metalwork under doorways. So agriculture and fertility. Agriculture would have been hugely important to these people. We know from looking at what animal bones we have that their diets were primarily domesticated animals. There's very little evidence of wild hunting. We know that they're farming and that farming is very important to them. And we get these grain storage pits, which are sort of beehive-shaped pits in the ground, particularly in Chalkland, which both of these are in. And grain storage pits are absolutely astounding in that a lot of them, way more than you would expect. I mean, I'm not even sure you'd expect any of them, but certainly it's a quite common thing in the Iron Age to find deposits of either human or animal remains that are, again, quite odd. Not that it's not odd to find dead things in the bottom of your grain storage pit, but often they seem to have been very deliberately placed. So this rather suggestive pair of dogs was found in Carshalton in southern England. I assure you, there is absolutely no way two dogs could have ended up in that position, in that pit naturally. Somebody was very thorough with positioning them. They would have been positioned with the flesh still on. You can tell that from the way the bones are together. And I think that the implications about fertility from that particular deposit really don't need to be explained. This, however, is a bit more of a stretch on the fertility front. The idea is that bodies in grain pits, because grain, these pits would have been used to overwinter grain, which you then take and plant in the spring and grow. These are sort of sacrifices to help with that. Is the idea. This is a body from Oxfordshire. This is, again, a body that has been positioned in a very non-standard way. They have had their feet cut off, and one foot is placed by the ribs, another is behind the head. It looks like their hands have also been cut off and placed in non-standard positions, and their legs are in this very odd, wide stance. Unfortunately, this is a relatively recent find, so I don't know anything about who this individual was, whether they were male, female, or how old they were, but it's definitely obvious that something has been done to their body before the burial. This is not a straightforward deposition of the body. You also get hybrid animals, which are a very strange phenomenon where you get these animal skeletons that appear to have been arranged and that are combinations of more than one animal. So these are both from Dorset in southern England. They're both in grain storage pits. This is a sheep with the head of a horse. Again, it would have been arranged while all the flesh was still on the pieces. And this is a sheep where, if you count the legs, you've got one pair here, and one pair here. Sheep, last I checked, don't generally have 6 legs, and it's only got 1 hip bone. So somebody has cut off the legs of another sheep and added them to this sheep. We don't know why they're doing this. I doubt we will ever be able to fully answer that question. But there's certainly something going on. And that brings me on to human sacrifice. So sacrifice is a really difficult question in the archaeological record. How do you recognize that somebody's been sacrificed? You know, is it meaningfully different from execution or murder? It's not an easy question. And I think especially with the question of whether or not it's execution or sacrifice, that's even more complicated, because if you look at the Roman accounts, it says that the Druids sacrificed captives, sacrificed prisoners, and if they ran out of those, then they sacrificed the innocent people. So, you know, it's not one thing or the other. Archaeologically speaking, when you're looking at sacrifice, it's even more difficult because generally we only have skeletons, and skeletons don't necessarily show how someone died. There are very specific things that will show up on your skeleton. So the things people do look for when investigating sacrifice is violent overkill and signs that there's something odd about the body. In this case, this is a case from Danebury. It's again, grain storage pit. Danebury had a lot of bodies in grain storage pits, both human and animal. A lot of them appeared to be deliberately positioned. This individual must have been tied up when they were buried. There is no way the body would end up in that position otherwise. In fact, there's a very interesting study I read a couple of days ago where they got some teaching skeletons and actually experimented and worked out exactly how that person must have been tied up, because otherwise when you decompose, gravity would have moved the bones in a different arrangement. Danebury also has a couple of skeletons that seem to have suffered from extreme violent overkill, where bodies have been violently dismembered, and there's quite a lot of trauma to the skeletons. But while looking at overkill, perhaps the easiest place to really see it is to look at bog bodies. So bog bodies preserve a lot better than skeletons. This is Lindo II, also known as the Lindo Bogman. He's currently in the British Museum. He was found in Lindo Moss, which is in North England in Cheshire. The Lindo man is very dead. I mean, obviously he's a mummy, but when I say he's very dead, what I mean is that he was stabbed, strangled, sustained a serious blow to the head, a broken neck, and he had a bunch of fractured ribs where somebody had, it looks like, sort of kneed him or kicked him in the back. This is not a man who died one death. This is a man who had an incredibly violent death. He was also found naked, except for this little fox fur armband. I know we only have the upper half of him in this picture. They did find all of him, but he was found by commercial peat cutting interests in the 80s, and they sort of cut him in half before they knew he was there. Now, I think the Lindo Bogman is quite a good example of human sacrifice, but again, archaeologically, this is not an uncontroversial statement. There are definitely academics who will argue that he was probably the victim of a mugging or a murder, and that he was put face down in the bog to hide his body. I think this is unlikely given the extreme overkill of his body. But it is a difficult question. It's also worth noting that the Lindo Bogman, he died after 43 CE, so after the Roman invasion. And one of the arguments about whether or not he is in fact a human sacrifice is that the Romans made human sacrifice illegal. It was one of their big sort of justifications about conquering Britain was, oh, look at these savages sacrificing people, we need to stop this. Now, personally, I am of the opinion that just because something is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And that the period directly after the Roman invasion, not all the people in Britain were particularly happy about the state of affairs. And societies in crisis tend to trend towards more extreme actions as far as religion goes. Even if you just look at Rome as an example, a couple of centuries earlier, when they were quite okay with human sacrifice, the examples we have are always on the eve of invasion or battle. So that's my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody has any questions, I will happily answer them.
All right, I'm back. Thank you, Ellen. That was so interesting. We have questions in both Q&A and chat. I'll start with the chat. Somebody says, is Celt a Latin word and what's in it? What is it in translation?
So it actually comes from the term Keltoi, which is Greek. I don't know the exact translation. I think it roughly translates to west of the Danube.
Thank you. Rebecca would like to know, was the Kentish warrior buried alone and in what context? Single grave, military pit, ditch, etc.
The Mill Hill Deal warrior was a single grave within a graveyard. Very rare for the Iron Age to have these sort of actual graves. Like I said, most bodies are found in spaces that are not graves, but there are a couple of exceptions in Kent, and he is one of them.
Thank you. Helena says she particularly liked the many-legged skeleton of sheep. And let's see, questions are pouring into Q&A. All right, somebody from our own children's department says this was amazing, and thank you. Karis would like to know, so do we think corpses were deposited in grain pits while they were in use? I can't imagine getting your grain out to eat covered in putrid corpse juice was pleasant.
No, so we think these were deposited as sort of closing rites when they stopped using the pits, almost as sort of a thank you is the main sort of theory. I think that might be reading, I might be making assumptions, but they weren't in use while the grain was in use. Also, they weren't necessarily, a lot of the deposits weren't necessarily rotting bodies. They would have just been bones at the time they went in.
Okay. Plus, if you needed to bury something, there's the hole all dug for you, half the work done.
Well, that is a theory. I think there's a little bit more going on, but that is certainly a theory that has been put forward by several people.
Okay. How did they get the torque around their neck?
So torques are horseshoe shaped, and you just sort of slide them on.
Do they bend a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, they're gold, and gold is not, they tend to be gold. You get some copper examples, but gold is quite bendy.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, you get a lot of bracelets that are that designed today, you know, you just slip them over.
All right. You talked about several bodies being found in one grave. What was the most number you've found, or that has been found?
Well, if you don't mind me using the example from after the Roman conquest, the first site I ever excavated professionally, actually in Surrey, we found a quarry pit which contained, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, which is embarrassing because I know that my supervisor who dug that site is on this call. But there were up to 19 MNI in a single layer. And then, so you can get upwards of 20 and such in some of these features. It can be a lot. But on the flip side, often you get features where you get a single human leg bone, and that's it. There's no other human bone in it. So it does run quite an impressive spectrum.
All right, thank you. Alan would like to know, I was under the impression that the Druids were credited with magical powers. Can you elaborate?
Well, kinda. I mean, you have to remember that in the past, there wasn't this really stark line between magic, divine, and everyday. You know, priests in lots of societies were considered to have control over the elements, to, you know, you can get God to intercede. And I think it's probably the same with druids. They were certainly portrayed in that sort of way. You know, even in the 17th century in Europe, magic is not considered something completely separate to everything else. Isaac Newton did alchemy. So I think it's really hard to talk about magical powers as sort of their own thing.
Right. Charlie says, as a researcher of ancient religion, do we have good definitions of what we mean when we say sacrifice, i.e., what's the difference between a sacrifice, a votive, any other offering, or even capital punishment?
So, no, it's quite difficult. Most of my life these days seems to be taken up by finding exact definitions and terms and trying to avoid the word ritual. Personally, I consider a sacrifice to be anything that is removed from the society. So I consider votive deposits to be sacrifices. That is not necessarily a majority view. You will find very different takes on it depending on who you're reading.
Thank you. Mike asks, are there other known examples of hybrid animal deposition, other places and times?
I don't know. That is something I'd need to look at. I know there are a few examples from Iron Age England. All the examples I'm aware of are in sort of central South England, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist in other places.
And Barney asks, what exactly do we mean by the 5% of people appearing in the burial record, and how do we figure out that figure?
So archaeologists, as I have said, look at people's rubbish and look at settlements, and we have an idea of how big the population would have been from looking at the remains of houses, by looking at how much waste is being generated, and so we have an idea of how big the society must have been, and we do not have enough bodies to represent that. Also, the demographics of the bodies we find are not, they're not representative of a whole society. For instance, we have very few children. And part of that is because children's bones don't survive, but part of that is also probably because they're not being treated the same way.
Why don't children's bones survive?
Because children have very tiny, thin bones.
Oh. Okay.
And they decompose faster.
All right. Someone actually asked that question, how were children buried? And the answer sounds like you don't really know.
I don't know of any specific rites. I have found child bones in quarry pits, and sort of I think some child bones were found at Danebury in some of the grain pits. But it, again, like everything in the Iron Age, it's really varied, and I don't have a single answer for you, I'm afraid.
Okay. Another question from Karis. When you say a statistical analysis was done to check whether the bone pits were randomly placed, was the outcome that they rejected the null hypothesis of randomness, or did they specifically find a particular pattern of locations?
They rejected the null hypothesis. The actual study is J.D. Hill's Ritual and Rubbish in Iron Age Wessex. I highly recommend it if you are interested in this stuff. It was done in 1995, and it still is one of the most influential texts for Iron Age studies today.
what is the null hypothesis of randomness, please?
So the null hypothesis is, and forgive me, my statistics is terrible. I might not be explaining this correctly. I tended to just trust J.D. Hill's book when it said this is not random, the statistics show, rather than actually understanding how to do the complicated statistical analysis. Haven't reached that part of my PhD, putting it off because I don't like numbers. The null hypothesis is if nothing is weird, the stats will reflect this thing. The number, the correlation number will be below a certain amount. I'm sorry, I really don't know how to explain stats. I'm very, very bad at statistics.
Okay. It's fine. Thank you. I was just curious for myself. Tom says, any thoughts on why the figure at the start was holding the torque, not wearing it?
I don't know. It is interesting though, because you do get some examples of people holding torques. In Iron Age Europe, famously, the Gunderstruck Cauldron has a horned figure that people have often interpreted as a god holding a torque. You do get figures wearing torques as well. I would need to look into that more.
Okay.
And probably with more than just a British sample.
All right. What's your favorite bog body?
Oh, cliche answer, but I really love the Lindo Bogman because he was found really close to where my grandmother lives. And like when I was first learning about archaeology, I just thought it was the coolest thing because we used to go visit my grandmother every summer, and I was always like, you know, oh my god, they found this Iron Age guy that had been brutally murdered really close. I just thought it was amazing. I quite like Otzi though, who I guess isn't a bog body. He's an ice mummy, but he's pretty cool. He's got tattoos, which, you know, pretty amazing. We have tattoos from the Ice Age, right?
He was the one found in Switzerland, right?
Yeah, in the Alps.
Okay. Rowena asks, any further reading on the topic that you'd recommend?
So it's a bit sensationalized, and I don't always agree with her findings, but Miranda Aldhouse Green has a book called Dying for the Gods, Sacrifice in Iron Age and Roman Europe, which is an interesting read. Again, I think she's a bit sensational. I don't agree with all her findings. I definitely don't agree that Caesar's an unbiased source, but it has beautiful illustrations and is very interesting as long as you take it with a pinch of salt.
All right, thank you. Someone else says, you mentioned your PhD work in passing. What exactly are you working on?
So my project is looking at what happens to human and animal bodies between the point when they die and they end up in these contexts. I'm specifically looking at things that aren't graves. So there's a lot of argument about whether or not bodies are being excarnated or manually defleshed or rotted down in bags in rivers. That's a theory I've seen. And I'm looking at bones microscopically to determine sort of what circumstances they decayed under and to work out sort of what happened to these bodies if they were processed, and if so, how.
Thank you. Irene asks when did the Druids die out and how? Of course, some of them are still around, but you say they're not the same.
I don't really know how to answer that question because it really depends on what source you're looking at. And since archaeologically, there's no real trace of them anyway, it's very hard to say. Theoretically, the Romans stamped them out. Theoretically. I will say that all that knowledge about Iron Age religion was definitely sort of lost in that period. In Ireland, in the medieval period, you get some people writing down old folk tales, which are sometimes used to infer Iron Age religion. I question how accurate a medieval folklore is at talking about something that's from several hundred years before, but it is a route some people take.
Thank you. And our last question is from your mom. who asks, is all art in this period abstract? Because she saw nothing that is nothing representational.
Most of it is abstract, not all, but most. And it tends to be really swirly, loopy patterns. What people think of as Celtic knotwork is not, confusingly, have anything to do with what is considered to be the Celtic period of history. It's actually all early medieval. But these sort of swirly patterns that you get, they're called latin. It's called latin art, is what's very characteristic of the Iron Age. You get it all over Europe, but you do get the odd represented figure. More common on the continent than in England.
All right, well, I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you for a fascinating, gory hour. You're always such good value, Ellen. Thank you. And I love this picture of the man with the mustache and the mullet.
I know, Iron Age mustache is fabulous.
That's a great parting image. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us wherever you are in the world. And please come back to the Glencoe Public Library for another program sometime. Thank you, Ellen. Bye-bye.